Hello there, I'm Alex Sargent and welcome to Uni-Q, the first regular political programme for the UK's youth. If you've got an opinion that you want heard, then now is the time to make it. We're going to be covering the topics that matter to you, affect you and most importantly, chosen by you. Well, this afternoon we're at the University of East Anglia, which is based in Norwich. It's quite a green university. 60% of its energy is generated on campus. Please give it up for the UEA. Right, okay, so let's get to our guests. They don't really have much of a clue what's going to happen, so give them a round of applause. Our first guest this evening was elected at the youngest age of 21 for a councillor for the Green Party. He's now going to be fighting Charles Clarke, the former Home Secretary, in the next election. Please give it up for Adrian Ramsay. Our next guest was elected as Britain's youngest MP in July of this year. She is representing the Conservative Party. We have a pleasure having her on this evening. It's Chloe Smith. And last but not least, representing the Labour Party, he's very local to politics in Norwich, and he's also standing to become a prospective parliamentary candidate in the next election, in which, in case he wins, he might actually be fighting Chloe in the next election. So, put your hands together for Phil Taylor. Right, so on with the show, and we'll go straight to our first question this evening.
What role should the UK play in the EU?
What role should the UK play in the EU? We'll start with Chloe, because you're the only female on the panel this evening.
There we are, that's as good a reason as any.
Yes.
Hopefully that's not my only reason for being in politics.
No, absolutely not. I'll make that very clear now.
As well as being 27, I have the answer to that question as well. I think that the UK should be in the EU but not run by the EU. That's basically where I come from. I would describe myself as a Eurosceptic, which has come over, I think, years of seeing the EU not necessarily benefit us over here. We get a lot of worry from my constituents and certainly plenty of others that we pay plenty into it but don't necessarily see the benefits come back, and what we feel like we see sometimes is a lot of obstruction that comes back. But that's putting it at a very simple level. The other thing I think we should be looking for at the moment is holding Gordon Brown to a promise on the referendum that he made about the EU constitution, thinly disguised as the Lisbon Treaty, which I understand the Czechs took us a step closer to signing last night.
Okay. Before we carry on, can I just clarify? We were listening to, or some people were listening to William Hague the other day on the radio about the Conservative plans for the next election. Will your party have a referendum if the treaty is ratified before the next election?
The point is we need to see if the treaty is ratified. That's the key point. I mean, I'm actually on tenterhooks about what the Czechs' decision now means.
Sure.
And if we were to form the next government, we would want to look at the situation as it there is, and we wouldn't want to let matters rest there, as William has been saying on the radio.
Okay, so there may or may not be a treaty after the next election.
Exactly.
And there may or may not be a referendum at the next election.
But for the government as it currently stands, they have promised that, and if as they have signed that treaty, from Gordon Brown's point of view, he should be held to the referendum that he promised us.
Right, okay. On that note, let's go to Adrian. Adrian, what's your views on this?
I think that the UK needs to play a positive and progressive role within the European Union. I think there's a lot of good things that come out of the EU, but I also think there's a lot of bad things that come out of the EU. And I think the debate about are you pro or anti-Europe is really quite a false one. I think the question is, what sort of Europe do you want to have? So I'm pro-Europe in the sense that the UK should be part of the European Union, should be about ensuring there's higher environmental standards required across the EU, that it's protecting rights of workers, that it's ensuring that we tackle poverty at home and abroad. And I think we see some of those things coming forward at the moment. We see, for example, legislation coming through that requires higher levels of recycling from European countries, and we see certain human rights standards put in place. But I think what we also see is too much power for unelected officials in the European Bank and the European Commission. I think we see too much power for transnational corporations operating at a European level, with the EU encouraging more and more long-distance free trade rather than trying to regulate it and ensure we have high labour rights standards and high environmental standards in what we produce. So I think we need to have a positive EU with the UK playing a progressive and active role in ensuring that it's more democratic, that there's more power for the Parliament compared to the unelected Commission, and that there's more power for the democratic institutions rather than the European Central Bank. So I'm sceptical about some initiatives within the EU. Overall, I'm sceptical about the Lisbon Treaty, although I think there's good things and bad things in it. But I'm very much in favour of a progressive EU, which is about high environmental and human rights standards throughout Europe.
So in a nutshell, would you say you're pro-Europe compared to the mainstream three parties, that is?
I'm not in favour of saying we need to have Europe in whatever form it takes. We need to have a Europe that results in high environmental and human rights standards. I think at the moment I have very mixed views about what the European Union does. What it does in one hand, it often takes away with the other.
Okay, we'll move on to Phil. Phil, you go last.
That's fine. I mean, I think it's sort of amazing to hear Chloe say that there isn't actually much positive that we can say that's come out of Europe. Often it feels like there isn't a lot positive that comes out of Europe. It's not a pound in, pound out judgment I think we ought to make about the European Union. It's the much more, it's the bigger benefits that we get from being in the European Union, whether it's the longest period of peace that we've had in Europe, or whether it's the, as Adrian absolutely says, the environmental standards and protection that we get, those standards that you can only negotiate across between countries rather than just within each country. And actually, the way I would agree though is that I think Europe needs to focus on doing a fewer things better than trying to spread itself very thin and interfere in every single minute aspect of our lives. I would sort of suggest that we need to focus on an economic structure that works for Europe. We need to focus on environmental standards that work, that benefit us and help us to tackle climate change. And we need to intervene as a union rather than rely on America, where we've got issues of security on our doorstep, whether it's ethnic cleansing or whatever happens in Bosnia, that we actually should be intervening ourselves rather than relying on people to come and do that for us. I think a European Union that focuses on those major issues would actually gain the respect of people in this country, rather than one that it sometimes perceives is interfering in areas of people's lives that it shouldn't. Where Chloe and I absolutely agree, by the way, is I think there should have been a referendum. I think we should have kept to our promise of a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, because it has actually meant large constitutional changes to our relationship with the Union. I back them, and I would have campaigned for a yes vote, but we should have had them. The reality is, though, we not only both agree that we should have had one, we ought to both admit there isn't going to be one. Our party isn't going to do it, neither is yours. It'll be ratified within days, as you know.
So that's a very honest approach. Do you think that Tony Blair should become the EU president if it happens?
Well,
i.e. the role is created that is more presidential, that isn't just a chair of the Council of Europe.
Well, I think there's no point creating a role and then deliberately putting someone in it who's no good at it. I mean, that seems to be the Tory argument. They didn't want it in the first place, but now it's going to be created. Let's put someone in it who's pretty ineffective and won't be a powerful voice for Europe because we don't want a powerful voice for Europe. I think that is a bizarre way of going about things. There is going to be a president of the council. Let's put in the best person for the job. That's how you normally approach applications for jobs and appointments. And I think let me answer you, and I think Tony Blair is by far the best person to do it. I also think it's slightly bizarre position for a patriotic Tory party to be saying that they don't want a Brit to be president of Europe. I thought that would be a pretty good thing for Britain to have a Brit as the president of Europe. If they're concerned about Britain not having a strong enough voice in Europe, this is the way to do it, surely. So yeah, I think Tony Blair would be really, really good. I'm not sure it's going to happen, but I think it would be good.
And just briefly, what would you want this new EU president to do in terms of the powers? I mean, very briefly, would they be chairing it, or would they actually be presidential and taking over the world in the sense that giving the EU more of a platform?
I don't think we need to worry about Tony Blair taking over the world, whether he wants to or not. I think what this gives us is the person that can negotiate on behalf of the European Union around the world. This is the person that the President of the United States can pick up the phone to and negotiate with Europe on foreign policy, for example. So when we had on our doorstep in Bosnia ethnic cleansing, and we were wanting Bill Clinton to intervene on our behalf, and he wouldn't, those negotiations took absolutely forever, during which time literally thousands of people died as Tony Blair was trying to force the European Union to take some action. In the end, we went in, and in the end brought the Americans with us. That would have been an absolute example where a president of Europe would have been able to have that negotiation and get action done quicker.
Okay.